Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be covering a really tough topic, so I do want to offer a trigger warning for anyone impacted by trauma. We're going to be talking about child sexual abuse and the importance of language. We know that 25% of children will experience or report experiencing child sexual abuse. So just tell us a little bit about why the words we use matter so much with those who've been impacted by trauma.
So words really matter, especially when we're talking about things such as sexual abuse and sexual assault. Very frequently, people don't talk to their kids about sexual abuse, sexual assault, and things like that. So sometimes in these cases, kids don't even really recognize that what's happening is not okay, right? Most sexual abuse and sexual assault in childhood happens with someone that they know and someone that they're supposed to trust, which can harm nearly every meaningful relationship that child will have moving forward in their life. If you're told, I'm supposed to trust this person, this is a person who I'm supposed to love, I'm supposed to trust, I'm supposed to be able to come to with things that are important, and this person harms you in such a deep way, and you don't know that you can tell someone, you don't know that it's not okay. If we're not calling this what it is, that can further complicate that trauma.
Keep in mind that when we think of sexual assault and sexual violence, we often think of this as an outwardly violent act. You know, you think of someone being trapped in an alley, being raped by somebody. For a child, a perpetrator or those who are causing harm might not need to use physical force. They might use things that are confusing to children, like play, threatening family members. They might use victim blaming statements like, you're so sweet, I can't help myself, or, you know, you were flirting with me, how do you expect me to behave? Manipulative behavior that is especially confusing to a child. And then when we use unclear language in describing that, especially if we use language that might place some of the blame with that child for either something they did or didn't do or didn't say, that can pack on additional trauma and additional impact to that child. So I think it's important to keep that in mind too, because that's some of what Maura and others do in therapy, is address some of those thought errors or cognitive distortions that people might have about the blame for the abuse, that I was partially to blame or I didn't say anything. Well, there were reasons why you didn't say anything. So it's our job as adults to be clear in our communication and use words and language that places the blame where it belongs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you have examples, things that we might say in everyday language that might be
Absolutely.
better?
The term child porn, for example, or child pornography, or even a worse term that is kind of an antiquated term as well, kiddie porn, is one that the media has used in the past. Those terms are very dangerous because they imply a level of consent that kids cannot give. If you really think about it, pornography is a business, but children are never able to consent to that, ever. Ethically, morally, legally, never. Consent is never okay with children. So to call it child pornography really is not accurate. The tides are kind of shifting to use the term child sexual abuse materials, or CSAM, as it is a much more specific term, it's a much more accurate term. It forces us to really examine what is this,
Exactly.
and what is the impact
When you
of
think about
this.
that, like it's very, like if you said child pornography to me, I would know what you meant, but that's really minimizing what's happening to that child. And I think we have so much to do to educate our community about that. So that kind of leads me to my next question. We actually recently invited in a few reporters to just kind of have some dialogue around this. How do you see this playing out, you know, even in the mainstream media, you know, not just our local paper, but, you know, some of the national coverage and so forth?
I think language especially matters in the media. I think how you use that language in written or verbal form in the media, it impacts and influences how the reader or the recipient of that media absorbs that information. Like just even the example of someone was found dead versus someone was found murdered. There's a very descriptive visual in that, and it impacts how I interpret that information. And language around victimization of children is the same. If we focus on the child and what they did or did not do, that is different than if we focus on the person who caused harm and what they did to manipulate that child, to exploit that child. And I think shifting that language is important and can change how the rest of the community talks about this type of violence as well, or any violence.
You know, whenever we're talking about sexual violence, we talk about power and control, right? Child sexual abuse is unique in that there is no instance in which the child is the one that holds the power or control, ever. And it's
that's a
very,
fact.
that is a fact.
So when we talk about journalists and media, and I used to be one, so I can speak with a little authority, you know, I would love to see this evolve to where it should be, because that is accurate.
Yes. And one point that I think is important to make is the most recent Associated Press style book. It says to only use child porn or child pornography if it's a direct quote or an excerpt. But in any other case, it does recommend using child sexual abuse materials. That when we're talking about current media cases, the way that we speak about these cases doesn't just impact these current victims, right? It impacts everyone who has survived that type of crime. So if we're speaking in a way that is not clear about who is to blame, it can be very triggering for people who may carry this trauma within them and have not said anything. It is very hard to come forward with this type of abuse, especially if it's childhood trauma that you've sat with for a very, very long time. There are so many reasons why someone would be afraid to come forward. And if we are not using language that is precise, it can perpetuate these ideas of shame, these ideas of guilt, these ideas of, well, you know, you did something to cause this.
And it's very telling that 2 out of 3 people who've experienced childhood sexual abuse don't come forward as children. Maybe because they don't have the language, or because the person who caused them harm threatened their family or them, or there were twists and manipulation around whose fault it was and who was to blame for it, which might lead people to not go to the police because they aren't certain about what happened, or if they had anything to do with that.
What are your recommendations for, you've certainly given the why, but you know, how can we go about educating to shift our thinking?
One of the things that we can do is to be brave enough to have these conversations, right? No one is going to step forward and be like, you know what I want to talk about today? Child sexual abuse. No, that's not going to happen. But if we are brave enough to say, you know what, this is a problem, and this is why it's a problem, and let's hold this space to really talk about the impact.
And think about, why are we even using that language in the first place?
Yes.
Is that to make ourselves more comfortable? Or is it to make that person who caused harm not get them to feel uncomfortable, or get them in trouble, or have negative consequences because of their behavior? We think a lot more about the person who caused harm and the impact on them than we do think about the child and the harm that was caused to them and the impact that was had on them.
Yes. I mean, when adults are in positions of power over children, every single time the onus is on the adult to not have sex with that child, to not sexually abuse that child. I don't care what the child is doing. It doesn't matter. The adult is responsible for not sexually abusing the child every time.
And that's a fact.
That's an objective truth. Yes.
I'm so glad you two are here. I feel so lucky to work with you. Thanks so much.